No, just do it. You're not changing stuff. Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today, especially my Ontario peeps. I know it's 8 o'clock for us here, so bear with me. We have a lot to cover. I will try to go fairly quickly, and we'll save some room at the end. So our plan for today is to look at theories of cognitive impairment and to challenge some old, outdated theories and to embrace new ones. We're going to look at risk factors, as well as testing, what you can do with your clients today at different ages and what we're looking for. We're going to look at treatment plans, where do we go from here, delve into holistic approaches, as well as daily lifestyle and some clinical pearls. We are currently in a brain health crisis. Over 41% of adults self-report anxiety or depression, 20% in brain exhaustion, 20% insomnia. Mental health related issues are on the rise, and absenteeism has increased by 33%, and that's from 2022 to 2023. From 2022 to 2023. And when we look at dementia, the numbers are even, when we look at things like dementia, the numbers are even bleaker. From 2020 to 2050, the number of people living with dementia in Canada is expected to increase by a whopping 187%. That's more than 1.7 million people likely to be living with dementia in 2050 in Canada alone. And when we think about Alzheimer's, it truly is a devastating disease, starting with memory loss, movement issues, and then finally leading to a loss of self. My mom died about 5 years ago, and one of my friends mother had been diagnosed with dementia, and she said to me, Debbie, you're actually lucky because at least you can mourn your mom. Whereas my mom's still here, but this person in front of me is not the person who brought me up. So we can just think about the emotional burden that this disease has on caregivers. And when we look at the economic burden in Canada alone, the economic burden is estimated to be 40.1 billion. They're actually saying that Alzheimer's is probably the most expensive disease globally when we look at the entire economic and mental burden. So we truly are in a brain health crisis. Now, the good news is that the research is out there. We just need medicine to catch up. And the problem is, when we start sailing that great big heavy ship, to turn it around takes a lot of time. And even we are still perpetuating different myths that are keeping us locked a little bit further in the back. So what are some of these myths that I'm still hearing people say? Things like women live longer than men and that's why they get dementia. That's not why. We're seeing things like dementia is an old person disease. It's not. It starts in your 40 or even earlier, and we need to look at it then. And also what really got us here is this war on fat. In the 1950s, an article was published, and the sugar board was behind it, and they strongly pointed the finger at fat and cholesterol as a problem with cardiovascular disease. And so we've had this war on fat since the 1950s, and to change someone's mind about the problem is very, very difficult. Here's an example of how we haven't necessarily changed the way we're treating, even though the research is out there. So this is a big umbrella study looking at the serotonin theory of depression. Now, I truly thought that once this study came out, we were going to look at the brain in a completely different way, and we were going to see a massive decline in the amount of SSRIs that were being prescribed. Because when we look at the results, this review suggests that the huge research effort based on the serotonin hypothesis has not produced convincing evidence of a biochemical basis of depression. We suggest it is time to acknowledge that the serotonin theory of depression is not empirically substantiated. Yet, we're still seeing antidepressants being described by medical professionals all over the place. We're still seeing, and the problem is that there really is harm that comes with it. We see that antidepressants have in fact been linked to an increased risk of dementia. So how did I get here? How did I get so passionate about brain health? Well, I was focusing on brain health in kids way back. I've been focusing on brain health in kids, probably for over 20 years. And then this happened. So let me tell you a story, setting the scene. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about how I got here, why I'm so passionate about brain health. So I've been focusing on mental health for over 20 years. As a matter of fact, I was even lecturing on this. I was lecturing on it. I was even giving lectures on this right around the time that this happened. So it was a mild day in 2016, and my daughter had stayed home that weekend. It was a mild day in September 2016, and it was a long weekend, so my daughter had asked if she could stay home from school. Not a problem. No, Debbie, what the fuck? Let's start all over again. Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. Tyler, thank you for that introduction. All right, let's get started. There's a lot to cover. Today we're going to talk about enhancing cognitive health through integrated approaches for brain longevity. So our plan today is to look at theories of cognitive impairment. We're going to challenge outdated theories and embrace new perspectives. We're going to look at risk factors and testing that you can do with your patients. We're going to look at treatment strategies. Where do we go from here? As well as looking into treatment strategies. Where do we go from here? And how can we change little small things in our daily life? We are currently in a brain health crisis. 41% of adults self-report anxiety or depression, 20 report brain exhaustion, 20 report insomnia. In fact, absences from mental health related illnesses have increased by 33% from 2022 to 2023. Now, when we look at things like dementia, the numbers are even bleaker. In Canada alone, we expect the number of cases of dementia to rise 187% in the next 30 years. So that's more than 1.7 million people living with dementia in Canada alone by 2050. And when we think about dementia, when we think about Alzheimer's, it certainly is such a catastrophic disease. Thinking of it as a loss of self. So starting with some memory decline. So it starts with mild cognitive impairment, goes into deeper memory decline, we have motor disorder, and eventually death. And it truly is a complete loss of self. My mom passed away 5 years ago, and while my mom was dying, my friend's mother got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And my friend said to me, Debbie, you're actually lucky because at least you can mourn your mom, whereas my mother is not here with me anymore, even though she is in body. So think about that. Think about the emotional burden that this puts on families. Think about the economic burden that this puts on families and the world in general. When we look at the economic burden of Alzheimer's, in Canada alone, it's estimated to be about $40 billion. And the global cost of dementia is expected to reach about $2 trillion by 2030. So one of the most expensive diseases worldwide. So we truly are in a brain health crisis. Now, the good news is that the research is there. Now we just need medicine to catch up. And the problem is that changing our belief is 10 times harder than teaching a new belief. So when we get that boat out of dock and it's sailing in one direction, turning it around is hard. And we can look at some of the myths that have gotten us here. That idea that women live longer than men and that's simply why they have more dementia. That's not the case. But for the longest time, we haven't worried about women's brains differently than men's. We need to start worrying. We've thought of dementia as an old person disease. And so we're not even worrying about it until you get older. It's something you can think about later? No, it's something we need to think about as early as our 40s. And another big myth is that fat is bad. And so in 1950s, we started the war on fat, and it's led to so many issues along the road we're going to talk more about later. So when we think about how medicine, the research is out there, but medicine needs to catch up. Here's a great example that I wanted to show. So when this umbrella study came out 2 years ago, showing that the serotonin theory of depression has been proven false. So the review suggests that the huge research effort based on the serotonin hypothesis has not produced convincing evidence of a biochemical basis for depression, and we suggest it is time to acknowledge that the serotonin theory of depression is not empirically substantiated yet. Yes, let's look at that. Yet, has the number of prescriptions decreased over the last few years? Not according to what I'm seeing, but not from what I'm seeing coming across my desk. So we need research. So we need the medicine to catch up. When we think about the first SSRI, the first antidepressant, it was actually a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and it was produced to fix tuberculosis. So it was actually created for an infection, and they found the side effect was people seemed to feel happier, and that's how the first antidepressant was born. But they never knew the exact mode of action. And the problem is that they're not all just doing good. We wanted, doctor do no harm, and antidepressants have been linked to an increased risk of dementia. So how did I get here? How did I get to the point where I'm so passionate about brain health? Well, I've been teaching about brain health for over 20 years. I've been teaching for brain health, and let me think about this. I've not been teaching for almost 20 years. I've had a focus on brain health since almost the beginning of my practice, focusing more on mental health and looking at children as well, and even children at the time. But then this happened. Let me tell you a story. It was a mild day in September 2016, and my 10-year-old daughter, she had a group of friends over. We went to the zoo. There was more sugar than normal. She had a sleepover, so there was no sleep. Really what ended up happening was this perfect storm, where there was inflammation, there was social anxiety because the girls got in a bit of a fight, and the next day she wasn't feeling well. She had a sore throat, so she asked me if she could stay home from school. Not a problem. Now the next day she seemed okay, so I said, you know what, sweetheart, I think you can go to school today. She ran downstairs, grabbed the biggest knife she could find, put it to her neck and said, Mommy, if you make me go to school, I'm gonna kill myself. She was diagnosed with the 95th percentile of anxiety. She was diagnosed with emotional dysregulation. Yes, they told us she might kill herself, not because she is depressed. Yes, they told us she might kill herself, not because she's depressed, but because she has such emotional dysregulation. So she was like a wild animal that would just attack at any time, and you never really knew what was going to trigger her. We hid all the knives. We didn't leave her alone with my son. Well, it turned out that she had PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with streptococcal infection. I suspect that many of you in the room have heard of it, but if you haven't, don't be embarrassed. I've given a similar talk to medical doctors, to psychotherapists, to psychiatrists, and the majority of them have still never heard of PANDAS. So the idea that an infection can cause these changes in the brain is new-ish to them, but it's not. When I started doing the research, and this is in 2016, mind you, I found books written about infection causing neurological changes that were written in the 1960s. And so what did we do for her? Well, 5 days of antibiotics got her back to school. And so that put me on this mission to want to change the way the world views the brain. We need to understand the root cause of what's going on, look at risk factors, and treat accordingly. And so fast forward to me being in my mid-40s, we know that menopause is a risk factor for brain health issues. And I did my genetic testing, and I also have the APOE4 allele. So I acquired a brain scan device. So I have an evoked P300 brain scan, and I did my brain test, and I was able to decrease my brain age by 12 years doing what we're going to talk about today. So I am so excited because research is out there. We need medicine to catch up, and we can pave the way to do this. So So when we think about cognitive decline or dementia, we need to think of it as a continuum of symptoms and a progression of disease. So, and a continuum of disease. So if dementia, we start to see mild cognitive impairment at around 65. So that's when we get noticeable symptoms. But before then, we have preclinical symptoms that are often considered normal symptoms of aging, like hard time finding words, loss of train of thought. We need to take those symptoms seriously. And that's because changes in the brain are happening at around 35, 40. We're seeing abnormal biomarkers, neuroplastic changes. And now the good news is that 40% of dementia cases worldwide can be prevented. And now if they can't be prevented, they very much can be delayed. And if we can delay the onset of dementia by 1 year, just in Canada, that's going to decrease the number of cases by 500,000 by 2050. If we can delay it by 10 years, 4 million. And by 10 years, that means that if we can delay it by 10 years, we can lower caregiver demand by almost 1 billion hours a year. So massive changes, and we can pave the way to make this happen. Now, you're going to hear me interchange these words at times, and that's because the research is going to be taken from different places. So sometimes I'll say Alzheimer's, sometimes cognitive impairment, sometimes dementia, sometimes just mild cognitive decline. But again, I want you to think of it as that continuum. So we want to catch it at any point and start reversing it. One of the other reasons this is so important is because there are currently no pharmaceutical drugs that treat Alzheimer's disease that work. So what happened was about 30 years ago, the Alzheimer's Society they funded a paper that found these amyloid plaques in the brain. And they then hypothesized that it's due to these amyloid plaques that Alzheimer's comes about. And so some drugs were made to dissolve these amyloid plaques. And there's been no new drugs on the market for 20 years. Now the problem is, we've now found dissolving those amyloid plaques sometimes cause more problem than the disease in the first place. So the side effects are huge, and there's been no new drugs that have been approved for 20 years until last year in the States. Lecanemab was approved. And when we look at the results, they were showing about a 27% improvement. And that can be pretty good. If you had a family member with Alzheimer's, you might say, yes, I would put them on this, even with the side effects being things like microhemorrhages, vascular edema, skin cancers. But when you do a deeper dive in the research and they compare to baseline, it's only about a 9.3% improvement. So not very good. We really don't have anything that works. So we've been barking up the wrong tree for 30 years, and it's time to turn that boat around. So how do we know this? Well, because in clinical trials, they found that reducing amyloid peptide production and amyloid formation in the brain did not slow cognitive decline or improve daily life in Alzheimer's patients. And they also found that scans and autopsies of normal brains also had these amyloid plaques. So they concluded that brain amyloid is not synonymous with dementia. It is a symptom, not a cause. Now, the good news is that now that we've moved past that outdated theory of the amyloid hypothesis, we can now move on to these new emergent theories. And the exciting thing is, this is exactly what we do. This is what we do as naturopathic doctors, as complementary functional doctors. So some of these I'm going to go into more detail, the calcium hypothesis, protein misfolding. Some of these you already know, and we'll just talk more about the research out there. So the calcium hypothesis, this is looking at the idea, all right, so the exciting thing is now that we've moved away from this outdated theory of amyloid plaques being the cause of dementia, we're now seeing all of these new theories emerge. And the exciting thing for us is that this is exactly what we focus on. This is what we do. We look at the systems in the body and we treat accordingly. And I'm going to put it to you that a lot of our brain issues, from autism to depression, have a lot of these as their basis. So we're going to go into some of these in a lot more detail, not all of them for the interest of time, but just quickly, we're going to go into, okay, so let's not say that. All right. And so what's so exciting for us is this is exactly what we do. We look at the body as a whole, we look at the different systems, and we treat accordingly. I'm going to put it to you that the majority of brain-related disorders have the majority of these as a root cause. The calcium as a root cause. So let's go through some of these. The calcium hypothesis. This is the idea that it's disruption in calcium homeostasis and the deterioration of calcium handling in the neurons that ends up leading to cell death and cognitive impairment. Protein misfolding and prion-like mechanisms. So instead of these tau proteins being beneficial, as they should in the neuron, instead they end up becoming tangled and they disrupt communication. The infection cause of dementia, the idea that it's a pathogen, a virus, a bacteria that's causing Alzheimer's disease. Of course, an infection can lead to neuroinflammation. It can be the cause, but neuroinflammation can also just happen from chronic inflammation anywhere in the body. mitochondrial dysfunction, vascular hypothesis, so not getting enough blood flow to the brain, gut-brain axis, so an imbalance in the gut microflora. It can lead to inflammation and neurotoxicity, environmental toxins like mold, air pollution, heavy metals, psychological stress, mental health, so chronic stress, anxiety, plays a role, genetics, hormone therapy, synaptic plasticity, and neurotransmitter imbalance. So here the idea is that synapses should be able to strengthen and weaken over time depending on what we need them to do. And when we lose that ability to strengthen or weaken, then that's going to affect our ability to learn and our memory. And finally, the idea that oxidative stress, so accumulation of oxidative damage in the brain, can damage nerve cells. So just a little bit more on the calcium hypothesis. So the calcium hypothesis is looking at the balance of calcium in the brain. So normal balance involves the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the synapse. Now, when we have excessive calcium, what happens is we get an increase in oxidative stress, we get mitochondrial dysfunction, leading to neuroinflammation and eventually neural death. And just before this happens, what we see is an accumulation of amyloid beta as well as tau proteins. Let's go a little bit more into what the tau proteins are. You're going to hear this one a lot. So in the normal brain, tau proteins help stabilize the microtubule. Then we have a nice healthy cell with great communication. So that's a neuron. In the Alzheimer's brain, these tau proteins become hyperphosphorylated. And so they no longer are stabilizing the microtubules. And then we also get these neurofibrillary tangles. And these tangles end up multiplying in a prion-like fashion, and they disrupt communication. And we also have a diseased neuron. So this neuron is going to eventually die, leading to cognitive impairment. The infectious cause of Alzheimer's is looking at the fact that herpes simplex, is looking at herpes simplex and a number of other bacterias, viruses, number of other bacteria and viruses. And the idea here is the infection leads to neuroinflammation, leading to tissue damage, protein aggregation, such as the amyloid plaques and tangles, which in turn can lead to more inflammation. And one of the reasons that they believe this is that in these amyloid plaques, they're actually finding microbial seeding, they're finding herpes simplex, and they're also finding the gingivitis bacteria. So when we think about all of these emerging theories of cognitive decline, what we now know to be true is that Alzheimer's disease is not caused by one mechanism. And that's why there's not going to be one pill, most likely, that's ever going to be able to treat it. We need to treat it as a multifactorial disease, which may include different pathogenic mechanisms that nonetheless result in similar clinical outcomes. So it's so important that we understand which of these mechanisms might be behind our patient's cognitive decline. Now, your patients aren't coming to you thinking about mild cognitive decline. Some of them are, but many of them are coming to you years beforehand. But if we're thinking about it, that's really what matters. So when we look at some of the risk factors, we're going to go through all of these. Because I think this is where we really are going to shine. Understanding the risk and supporting our patients accordingly. And this is also how you're going to get the best compliance, you're going to get the best return visits, because you're thinking of your patients long-term, not just for what they're coming in for. So being female increases your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease more than 2 times. Now in the past, we believed this was because women lived longer than men. And that's why we now know that's not true. We now know that significant changes occur in the brain due to estrogen loss. Estrogen is protecting the brain from cognitive decline. And this has to do with your entire estrogen exposure over time. So your age of menses, your number of pregnancies, use of the birth control pill, and type of birth control pill, and age at menopause. Estrogen and progesterone truly are our superpowers, and both are neuroprotective. So estrogen influences the structure of the brain. Think of it as a bit more yin. Looking at chemistry of neural pathways by boosting brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We're going to talk more about brain-derived neurotrophic factor shortly. It increases dendritic spine densities and enhances synaptic organization, and it helps to regulate the cholinergic systems. Progesterone also is a superpower, and it's neuroprotective in the brain. It's neuroprotective by inhibiting exocytation. It's another reason why calcium can be such a problem, that complete stimulation of the nerve, it promotes myelin repair, and it exhibits an anti-inflammatory effect. It's one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating that so many times patients are getting prescribed estrogen without progesterone if they don't have a uterus. Like, progesterone has absolutely no benefit in the body, yet we know that in the brain it sure does. All right, let's talk about one of the first times the brain changed dramatically due to hormones. And that was back when women were pregnant. So we're going to focus on women for a bit longer. So we know that the brain shrinks when you're pregnant. We've seen it on MRIs, and that there's a reduction in gray matter volume, calling brain shrinkage. Now, causing brain shrinkage. So it's not just your wife. So men out there, it's not just your wife being super anxious about your kids. Her brain actually changed that way when she was pregnant, changed so that she would be this way when she was pregnant. Now, for the longest time, we thought that this only lasted for 2 years. It was a 2-year phenomenon. That was simply because the studies only were studying for 2 years. Here's a study published in 2021 that looked at the brain of mothers 6 years after pregnancy. And they said, yeah, you know what? The changes are still there. So perhaps they're permanent overall. And they've then suggested that this should be a relevant demographic variable. So not only do we need to think of men's brains and women's brains differently, we have to think of the age. Not only do we have to think of the age of the brain differently, men's brains and women's brains differently, but has this woman had a pregnancy or not? That's another possible demographic variable. Another time that your brain shrinks is during menopause. So it's the frontal and temporal cortices, as well as the hippocampus. And of course, what are these the most important for? Higher cognitive tasks and memory. Another way that estrogen works, not just by causing shrinkage of the brain, is that it helps to control glucose metabolism. And so when we have estrogen deficiency, this is going to impair the function of the mitochondria in glucose metabolism. So in menopause, the brain goes from nearly exclusively dependent on glucose as a single fuel to now having auxiliary fuel, so also using lipids and ketone bodies. If it doesn't have enough fat, it's just going to catabolize the white matter in the brain. And this is particularly detrimental for women with the APOE4 variant. Hot flashes are another risk factor for women. So every time a woman has a hot flash, it causes these micro intensities in gray matter in the brain. And the more micro intensities we have, the higher your risk of cognitive decline. I wanted to include a study by Lisa Mosconi. She really is the one waving the flag right now, leading the charge that we need to look at women's brains very differently than we look at men's. So in this study, she was looking at only estrogen receptor densities. And simply by looking at estrogen receptor densities, she was able to predict if a woman was postmenopausal or premenopausal. Depending on the number of estrogen receptors, she was able to see that there was the number of estrogen receptors So the higher estrogen receptor densities resulted in lower memory scores. So the higher the number of estrogen receptors in areas related to cognitive function, the lower the memory scores. So I'm from Africa. Let's think of it shade. When you go to a safari, shade is in high demand. So we're going to see all of the animals congregating underneath that one tree, hoping to get just a little bit of that shade. So that's what these estrogen receptors are doing. They're congregating to areas that they need them the most, hoping to get just a little bit of estrogen to help support that part of the brain. All right, more risk factors. Age is a big one. Of course, this goes without saying. The older you get, the higher your risk of developing dementia. Depression history. So history of having depression increases your risk of dementia, as does using SSRIs. Head injuries, so even one concussion earlier in life has been shown to increase your risk of dementia, and dementia due to head injuries is dose dependent. So one injury is going to increase it by 1.2%, and it's going to continually go up from there. All right, genetics. If you have a close family member with dementia, you have a 30% increased risk of having it yourself, and as well as we can look at specific genes. So there are 20 different genes that have been studied for dementia, with the most widely studied one being that APOE, that one I told you that I have. I have one E3 and one E4. So that's not as bad as having two E4s, but it's not good. So what does it all mean? It all has to do with what is on in the position of the 112 and the 158. So what base is attached to that? If you are lucky enough to have two cysteine bases, then you have protection of your brain. Lucky you, your brain is not just doing what it should, but is actually being protected. The E3 is just neutral, neither good nor bad. And that O4, the E4 with 2 arginine, that is detrimental. Giving you a better understanding of what's happening here. So in a healthy gene, what we see is that the APOE is produced in the astrocytes, and then it gets transported for lipidation. And there it's involved in supporting the cell membrane to make it nice and firm. It's involved in detoxifying fatty acids, neuron repair, as well as dendritic growth, and maintaining that synaptic plasticity. In a pathological brain, so somebody who has a lot of APOE4, or even if there's some reason that the cell thinks it's in cell danger, there's maybe inflammation, what we see is that we get this accumulation of the fats inside the astroglia and the microglia, so they're not coming out like we need them to. We're not getting lipidation. It's going to lead to inflammation and eventually lead to neuron death. This also ends up causing these beta amyloid plaques. Think of amyloid as cholesterol. It comes out there to try to protect you if it thinks something is going wrong. To protect you if you think something is going wrong. So a symptom, not a cause. When we have these increased amyloid plaques, we're also at risk of coronary artery disease. The APOE4, the OPAE2 variant helps bring cholesterol out of the brain. And here this isn't happening, so putting us at increased risk. We also see an increase in tau proteins, tau protein tangles, the phosphorylation of the tau, and then we get the neuron degeneration. So in a nutshell, that's what's happening when somebody has the O4 variant. All right, other risk factors. In about 2005, the idea or the term type 3 diabetes for Alzheimer's came about, and that's because there's such a correlation between diabetes and Alzheimer's. Now, of course, if you were diagnosed with Alzheimer's, you've been swimming in metabolic dysfunction, in insulin sensitivity for probably over 10, 15 years. For over 10, 15 years. So hyperglycemia, not just diabetes, is going to lead to this increased inflammation, which can damage blood vessels and neurons. But it goes to more than just the damaged blood vessels and neurons. We see that we also get this decrease in acetylcholine, and this reduction in acetylcholine is going to impair cognition. We also get this accumulation of amyloid and a decrease in its clearance. Here's the inflammation we talked about. And we also are going to get this hyperphosphorylation of the tau proteins. All right, so I don't want you to just think of it as an Alzheimer's issue. Anything that's going to alter glucose metabolism is going to lead to an energy crisis. And so let's think of Alzheimer's or cognitive impairment as an energy crisis in the brain. So yes, it can be insulin resistance, but it can also be deficiency in the GLUT4 receptor. What about mitochondrial impairment? Mitochondrial impairment can cause this energy crisis. Not being able to use glucose properly with even that low estrogen we talked about, oxidative stress, all of these are going to lead to intracellular uptake of glucose not being as efficient as we wanted to, leading to brain atrophy, amyloid plaques, and eventually at least cognitive impairment. All right, another risk factor is brain reserve. Now this is the amount of actual brain tissue you have. And so the idea here is that the more you have, the more you can lose before symptoms arise. So remember, we're thinking of Alzheimer's as this continuum. So So maybe we'll never have the actual symptoms, even if we're starting to see some degeneration earlier if we have a bigger brain. So that's brain reserve, the amount of brain tissue you have. Cognitive reserve, on the other hand, is all about the way the brain thinks. So the brain will use pre-existing cognitive processes to get from one point to the other. And so the more ways it can think outside the box, the better you're going to be and the longer it will take for symptoms to arise. For example, if you're trying to get from point A to point B and you only know this one way, you only have one strategy, then there's going to be problems if we're having some kind of cognitive impairment. And so if you're destined to get dementia for whatever reason, what we can do with cognitive reserve is really push that time back. So this x-axis represents time. This is your cognitive test score, so let's just call it symptoms. If this is where an Alzheimer's is going to happen, we can see how much longer it's going to take if you've got a high reserve versus if you have a low reserve. So this kind of sounds like neuroplasticity. So I thought this would be a good time to just talk a little bit more about neuroplasticity versus cognitive reserve and how they work together. So neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections. Cognitive reserve refers to the brain's ability to improvise, to find alternative ways of completing tasks despite any kind of brain damage. So it allows individuals to maintain cognitive function longer, even in the presence of brain pathology of any kind of neurodegeneration, like Alzheimer's or other neurodegeneration. So cognitive reserve relies on brain plasticity to build resilience and adapt to challenges. Neuroplasticity provides the underlying mechanisms by which cognitive reserve is enhanced and maintained. All right, we can talk more about maintained. Other risk factors. How much have you moved your body your entire life? So it's not just about when we're getting older, but right from when we were a child on. The more of a history you have of moving your body, the healthier your brain and the slower any progressive disease will happen. Systemic inflammation. We know inflammation is the root cause of so many diseases, if not all chronic degenerative disease. And so we need to look at the lifetime exposure of inflammation. So allergies, autoimmune, sinus infections, these all should be considered when we're analyzing somebody's risk. Oral hygiene, there's a strong link between oral hygiene and Alzheimer's. We're actually even finding, as I mentioned, we're actually even finding that gingivitis inside amyloid plaques. So we know that it can travel into the brain, finding it's destroying neurons. There's a correlation between hearing loss and cognitive decline. At this time, they're not exactly sure why. They're thinking that it might be due to withdrawal, so withdrawing from social activities, leading to loneliness and less activities overall. I wouldn't be surprised if in a few more years we find some other correlation there as well. Cardiac issues, so when you think of the heart and brain go very closely together. So a history of atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, they're all going to be linked to increased risk of cognitive impairment. Lifestyle factors, smoking, diet, stress, exposure to air pollution, alcohol, being underweight earlier in life, being overweight earlier in life are all going to play a role. All right, so there's just the list of the different risk factors that you want to observe with your patients. Tony Robbins says, change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. I say change happens when we have measurable metrics and have something to work towards. So the motto in my clinic really is measure it, mend it, maximize it. I have a number of different assessments that I do in-house, as well as different therapies to maximize it. But let's talk about some of the biomarkers that you can do with your patients. The APOE genetic test, that's a great one to start, especially if the patient's worrying about brain health. I have an EEG brain scan. So this is a provoked scan where there's a sound, and you can measure how much power your brain can put towards certain tasks, which is a way of looking at brain reserve. Your brain can put towards certain tasks, which is one way of looking at brain reserve. No. right, so I have an EEG brain scan in my clinic. So there's a couple in Ontario, I'm not the only one who has one, but it's a provoked brain scan. So just like you would do an ECG on your heart, this is an EEG on the brain, and it's measuring your brain waves. It's measuring your brain waves, as well as how much power and energy your brain can put towards during certain tasks. I'll show you a little bit more about that momentarily. Let's think about metabolic dysfunction. We know how detrimental insulin resistance can be, so we can do a quick hip to waist ratio, looking ideally to have a 0.7 or as close as possible to that as being the ratio in women, closer to 1 in men. We can look at HbA1c, which is going to let us know HbA1c, so we can look for insulin resistance, but a calculated Homer score is going to give us a bit more accuracy and help us find that earlier. So looking at using fasting insulin and fasting glucose to get that score. Now the omega-3 index test, that's not one that I actually do as much, simply because I try to do a cost-benefit ratio, and I'm going to put my patients on omega-3. It's such an easy sell because it helps with almost everything. It helps with so many other things. But if you are going to do one in your clinic, if you are going to do it, the optimal range is between 8 to 12%. And the higher the number, the more brain protective. And it is particularly important for those of us which have the APOE4 allele. Here's a little bit more about that brain scan. So over here, this is showing the brain reaction voltage. So how much power and energy the brain can put towards certain tasks. Brain reaction time. So this is when the brain hears a sound, how quickly does it hear it? And this is your physical reaction time on this. Now, typically we get a map of the brain, and we know what a healthy brain is going to look like, and things like concussions, dementia, areas of the brain that can't put as much power. We're going to all see changes in that voltage. It looks at brain waves, so we can actually see how the theta beta wave ratio, which helps us understanding attention, frontal alpha beta, having more of an understanding of mental health, anxiety, depression. And then there's also a trail making test, which is a bit of a memory cognition test, And the biggest thing that I'm doing with this whole testing is to get a baseline. I want anybody 45 and older to at least get a baseline so we know where we are. So when change happens, we can see how it compares, or then when we have a measurable metric, we can make change happen. So when I had this, I was able to be more consistent with all those things that I knew I should be doing anyway. How many of you are measuring HRV in your clinic? So most of your patients are walking in there with an HRV monitor on their wrist already. So the Apple Watch, the Fitbit, there's so many out there, and they're probably not using it. They're probably using it just as a pedometer and to check their email messages. So you're going to have to convince them that they need to wear it at night so we can understand their sleep. But this is a great little tool that you can use to get some idea of what's going on with sleep. Of course, if it's something we're really worrying about and you want to send them for a sleep study, that's an option. But here you have a nice, easy tool that more often than not, they're coming in with. And HRV is also there, and HRV allows us to understand what's happening with the autonomic nervous system. The higher the HRV number, the better. And again, they're probably wearing one. I even use it to see, are we getting better? I want to see that HRV marker go up as I'm treating my patients. So it's a nice little test that we can have right there. CRP and ESR, using those for inflammation. I like to do a full thyroid panel for all of my patients. Hypothyroidism has a lot of similar symptoms to cognitive decline, and so we can get that mental sluggish and not know the root cause. Make sure we understand what's happening with the brain. So a good cardiovascular panel overall. Nitric oxide, that's a quick, easy little test you can do in clinic if you want. Vitamin D, higher vitamin D correlates with better memory, and that's especially in people with the E4 variant. Visual contrast testing, it's a nice non-specific test for neurological function. I've been doing it for mold for years and years in my kids when I was treating kids more. And homocysteine, we know homocysteine is a marker of inflammation, and it's also known to be a direct neurotoxin. All right, so here's a study I found on the visual contrast sensitivity for thinking about things like Alzheimer's. As I mentioned, I was using it more for mold because it's not a specific test, but it's cheap, it's fast, it's not invasive. As a matter of fact, it's free because they're doing it still for research purposes. So when you do if you do the test with your patients, You're just doing it so you can use it as a comparison as you start figuring out what you need to do with them. Are you detoxifying them? That may be a difference if we see neurotoxicity. Is it more that we're worrying about, or for neurotoxicity? And it can also just be a good biomarker. So it's super cheap, so you can start doing your therapy and then do it again a couple of months later to see if whatever you're doing is pushing the needle. Because when it comes to brain health, it's so subjective, isn't it? You know, people will say, yeah, I've got more energy, but the sun's out today, or I had a better sleep. And so it's hard to really be able to pinpoint how much is this actually helping. Nitric oxide, that's a quick non-invasive saliva test you can do in your clinic. And of course, nitric oxide helps with vasodilation and blood flow. It also is involved in synaptic plasticity. And homocysteine, we know that homocysteine is a modifiable risk factor for development of cognitive decline and dementia. So blood homocysteine directly correlates to a person's memory, mental alertness, and mood. I remember reading a study years back, and they had looked at school-age children, and they got their blood, and the researchers were able to predict the scores of the kids based on their homocysteine levels. All right, so risk factors done. So now once we've taken a nice comprehensive view of the risks, now we have to decide where are we going to start? What's the most important thing we want to focus on? So what are some of the treatments for these risk factors? Well, let's go to brain reserve. So brain reserve is the amount of actual tissue, the amount of the size of your brain. So the bigger and denser your brain, the more function you can lose. Well, the first strategy you want to think about is stop the shrinkage. We want to decrease the neurotoxicity. So getting rid of heavy metals, alcohol. How much alcohol is okay? We know that alcohol causes neurological issues. We know that it causes memory problems. How much is okay? Some researchers are saying none, that we should be doing no alcohol. Others are saying 1 glass, 2 glasses might be okay, especially if it's going to decrease stress. I think you have to look at the patient in front of you and treat accordingly. Botox. I'm seeing some studies that are showing that Botox might be contributing to memory decline. So I'm going to think about stress. Cortisol. Cortisol is going to cause those neurons to shrivel up and possibly die. So what can we do to decrease stress? And so these are all things we're doing to stop the shrinkage. And another one would be hormone therapy. Here's a systematic review published in October of 2023. They looked at 6 million women who were given estrogen-based therapy, and the findings suggested that women who took hormones in midlife to treat their menopause symptoms were less likely to develop dementia. So of course it does depend when you start, because we're seeing that those that starting at over the age of 65 did not have the same kind of benefit from it. Another strategy to improve brain reserve is exercise. My favorite thing. I'm a fitness instructor. I teach body combat, so a boxing type class, and I truly contribute exercise to my energy, to the amount of energy I have. And I'm hoping that it's what's going to keep my brain safe from that OPA-OE4 gene, as well as all these other things we're talking about. And so what kind of exercise? Well, they found that even 4,000 steps has been shown to increase gray matter. And what should we do? Well, this is, instead of doing steps, let's do something that's a bit more complex. So dancing or boxing. And ideally, this isn't just 4,000 steps over time. This is 4,000 steps where we're focused and we're trying to make something happen. Another study showed that omega-3, the higher red blood cell levels of EPA and DHA, the larger the total brain and hippocampal volume. The larger hippocampal volume, we saw another systematic review showed that the more omega-3s the person had, increased learning, memory, cognitive well-being, and blood flow to the brain. So lots of good things that omega-3 can do just here. We want to start young. Ideally, you're going to start in your 50s. And we know that Cytomatrix has a great lineup of different omega-3s depending on what your goal is and what you're focusing on. If you're looking more for mental health, anxiety, depression, you want to have a lot more of that EPA. We're even thinking, at least a 2-to-1 ratio, maybe even a 6-to-1 ratio. If we're thinking more about the actual structure, so we want to get we want to think about brain reserve, making it a bit bigger, I might go for the omega liquid for it. That's a 1-to-1 ratio. It's a 1-to-1 ratio of EPA to DHA. And then for inflammation, I'm going to go back to more of a 2-to-1 ratio, so a higher level of EPA, something like that. The peak EPA, or even the omega-3 liquid, the omega liquid with the vitamin D3. And I think they even have more than just this, but these are the 3 that I typically will use in my practice, depending on what my goal is. All right, cognitive reserve. So remember this one? This one was all about, cognitive reserve was all about the way the brain thinks. So if you were lucky enough, and you are because you're in this room, to have a higher education, you have a decreased risk of getting dementia or Alzheimer's, as is your risk because you are right here today doing continual learning. Continual learning at work shows that you have a decreased risk. If you don't get continual learning at work, you have a 2.25 greater risk of developing dementia, just like if you didn't have a higher education. And a lot of your patients might not. Now, what can we do? What's a strategy for this cognitive reserve? Social engagement, that's probably the number one thing we can do. And since COVID, this can be tough. This can be really tough for our elderly. Frank, this is tough for our teenagers. I'm shocked to see how much less teenagers go out today than they used to, especially since COVID. So what is this going to mean for mental health? What is this going to mean for brain health in the next 20 or 30 years? I really don't know. But what they are doing is mental stimulation, so that's good. But we need that mental stimulation to be complex and novel. So what we found is learning in one domain, such as doing things like crossword puzzles, Sudoku, they actually don't carry over into multiple domains. What does carry over is complex and novel. So there was a study done on Rise of Nations. So Rise of Nations is a computer-based game. It's a role-playing game, and there's a lot of things going on all over the place. And it's frustrating and it's hard for the elderly, for people that are over 65 apparently, but this is one of the things that actually seemed to push the needle when it came to cognition, which is hard to do in the elderly. Once we've already got issues happening, it's hard to start to reverse them. And as a matter of fact, the next thing that the researchers are planning on doing is Rise of Nations with movement. So that's going to be an exciting study to look out for. Now, what about learning a new language? We're always told that learning a new language is going to be so beneficial for the brain and it's going to help with the synapses. As in my opinion, I thought so would meditation. And so I came across the study that was published in 2023 that was looking at what are the effects of learning a new language, what are the effects of meditation, and what are the effects of doing nothing on cognition. So there was those 3 arms, language, meditation, and doing nothing. And the thing they were looking at as a final marker was cognition. So was cognition. Now it was fairly intense for the language as well as the meditation. There was a 2-hour weekly group session. There was daily home practice as well as 1 day of more intense. And looking at episodic memory, executive function, and attention as how they were measuring cognition. And after the 18 months, what was found was no interaction. And so they concluded that meditation, learning a new language, did not confer with cognitive effect. So neither learning a new language, meditation, nor improve cognition did not improve cognition in elderly patients, nor do brain games like Wordle or crosswords. Now, before we totally roll out meditation, I think we need to take a few steps back, because here's a study published in 2023 to show us that stress really is an overlooked risk factor for dementia. And we need to think about stress throughout your entire life, not just at old age. They looked at 40 studies between 1985 and 2020, and they concluded that reducing stress exposure and improving stress management when stress exposure cannot be changed that's relevant strategies in dementia risk reduction. So I know meditation. So we know meditation is going to help. We know meditation is going to help with stress reduction. The problem is it's hard. Not a lot of people can do it. Not a lot of people want to do it. The people who want to do it, and the rest of us don't. And so here's a study I wanted to throw in because it makes me think maybe it doesn't have to be that hard. Maybe for some of us,